All right, so what options have we got for making our research more valid? We're going to start off by taking a look at an advanced two-condition design. And really this is an experiment where you have two conditions, an experimental condition and a control condition. But there are some things we did in this experiment that made it a little bit more valid than your standard two-condition design. In this study, we were teaching people some words in the language Tagalog, which I believe is the Filipino language. And so they were shown a series of vocabulary. You can see here on the slide it had the Tagalog word next to the English word, so Tagoget means pilot. There were three phases to this study. In the first phase, they were shown the vocabulary with the English word. And in that first phase, the vocabulary and English word were shown on top of a video context. The video context was unrelated. It had color, it had sound, but there wasn't really any words involved. It was just something kind of in the background of the words. In phase two, everyone saw all of the words again. However, some of the words had the original context background video, and some of the words had a new context video. And again, the videos were not related to the words, they were just in the background. Now in this phase two, while they were seeing the word a second time, they had to say, how well do I know this Tagalog word? 0 to 100%. Then phase three, the vocab test, they get the Tagalog word, they have to write the English word. Now the idea for this study was that if people are asked, how well do you know the word? They're going to say they are more confident if they have a familiar context than if the context was unfamiliar. And that is actually what we found. They thought they knew the words better when they had seen the background video before than when they hadn't seen the background video before. Maybe something about the background video made things seem more familiar and therefore they were more confident. Now there were a bunch of things that we needed to be careful about in this experiment. Let's break them down here. First, we needed to pilot the word list difficulty. Piloting simply means doing something ahead of time to see how it works out. So we had people do the study a couple of times and just see how hard were these words to learn. We wanted to make sure the words were not too easy or too hard, so that they had a reasonable chance of getting them more or being more or less confident about them during that judgment of learning phase. We also wanted to make sure that the contexts were not too distracting. So we had people watch the videos and then say, well, how distracting was the context? We looked at how well they remembered the words with each one of the different contexts, just to make sure that the backgrounds were not too distracting and weren't affecting their memory. Next up, we worked through internal validity concerns. The first one being we wanted to make sure that the contexts and the words were not too similar. So in this case, we have a background video of cars driving on a road, and the word was pilot. So we didn't want pilot to be related to the background video, and so we kind of had to go through and think for ourselves, is a video about cars going to be related to pilot? And could that relationship make it easier or harder to remember the word? In most cases, it wasn't too much of an issue, but we also used piloting to deal with that. We had people let us know if something about the video made it easier to remember the word, because we really didn't want that to happen. Next up, we made sure to check whether or not people were getting better test scores if they had seen the same context video versus the different context video in the judgment of learning phase. Now this is an internal validity issue because we do not want people to actually remember the words better due to the context. We only thought that they would be feeling more confident. The idea here being that, well, if you take notes in class and then you study your notes at home, you're going to finish studying those notes too soon because they're familiar to you, because you wrote those notes because they're familiar. You're going to finish studying, you're going to stop studying before you're actually ready for the test. And so the internal validity concern there was that the familiarity would actually make people actually make people better at their memory, and therefore they should feel more confident. So we did that through piloting as a way to deal with internal validity. The last one here, repeated context test score improvement. Actually, that was what I was just talking about. The judgment test score improvement was, does making a judgment about the word improve your test score? Does saying I know this word or I don't know this word very well improve your test scores? And so the way we dealt with that is just by having this control condition, but we didn't want that to be too much of an issue, and it really wasn't. Some external validity concerns. As a reminder, internal validity is, are you actually researching what you want to research? So we want to research, does this make you more confident without it actually affecting your test scores? So we checked these things. External validity is generalizability. So does this effect, does this finding translate to other conditions or the real world? So one thing that we were concerned about was, were we calling attention to the manipulation? What do I mean here? So half of the words in this first experiment were shown with the original context and the other half with a new context in that second phase. The thing is, we were concerned that what we were doing is reminding people that some of the words were familiar because of that context, but some of the words were less familiar because they could objectively say, oh, I've never seen that video before, maybe the words are less familiar too. And so what we did is we did another experiment where everyone saw only the same words, or a totally different group of people only saw words with a different context. So there was no way for one person to say, okay, I've seen this video before, but I haven't seen that video before, therefore my word familiarity for the words is going to be higher or lower. That way we could say that it's not necessarily an affectation of the experiment. It's not something that happened because of our design. It's actually an effect that happens in the real world. Another one is effects specific to one type of judgment. What we're talking about here is, well, maybe if people use those percentage-based judgments of learning, they have more nuance to what they're saying. So we tried a version of this where we just had people say yes or no, I'm familiar with that word, and we found the results to be the same. And so kind of what we're doing to improve our external validity here is just mess with the experiment, mess with the design of the experiment, screw around with the things that aren't necessarily supposed to be important, just to show that they aren't important and we find the same results even when we change them. So there we go. Piloting, doing something ahead of time. It's almost like a practice round, make sure things work the way you want them to. Dealing with internal validity, making sure we are researching what we intended to research. Dealing with external validity, making sure that our research results are true in more than just our current condition, or generalizability. Okay, so one thing you can do, another totally different thing you can do to make sure that your research design is valid is you can go for a matched design study. What am I talking about here? So let's say that you're going to give a group of people an intervention and a different group of people a different intervention, or no intervention. Like maybe you're going to give half your second grade boys the self-control intervention and half the second grade boys no self-control intervention. But you're concerned that the two different groups of people were different groups of people, and therefore they might react to things differently. And so what you can do is create a matched subjects design where you go through and you pick out, okay, for every person, for every kid who had Sorry, I had to sneeze there. For every kid who had a high level of rowdiness in the self-control intervention, we're also going to have a kid who's high level of rowdiness in the no self-control intervention. For every kid who's not rowdy, we're going to have one kid who is not rowdy in the other group. You might do matching based on age. For every kid who's exactly 8 years and 4 months, there's also going to be another kid who's 8 years and 4 months in the other condition. By going through and making matched pairs of research participants in your different conditions, that's one way to make sure that your two different groups of people, or participant groups or condition groups, are as similar as possible, with the exception of the intervention. Another thing you can do is a yoked design. This is kind of an uncommon design, but it's one that I do see here and there for interesting paradigms. The yoked design comes from the word yoke. It's the way that you put together two bulls or ox to have their heads kind of hooked up together, so they have to move together. These guys are used to plow fields, and so you want to plow the fields in the same way. Since the plow is super heavy, you want to make sure that two different ox are moving simultaneously, so you yoke them together. Now, what is a yoked design? Yoked designs are used when most often when you're dealing with interventions that have different time conditions. What am I talking about? So let's say you're doing an experiment where you're seeing how long do students choose to study. And so in your experimental condition, your students are given the option to study shorter or longer, and they're using a new type of studying program. And they can choose when they think they're done. And in the control condition, they're using good old flashcards. Now the thing is, you want to give your experimental condition all of its choice to do whatever it wants. And so you're going to say that you're going to let those experimental students choose to stop studying whenever they want, but you don't want that to really be a huge effect on your other conditions. So the yoking in this case would be that you have two participants completing the study at the same time, and the guys who are using the studying program choose to stop whenever they want. But whenever the person doing the studying program stops, then the person in the control condition with the flashcards has to stop as well. They are forced to stop by the computer and move on to the next part of the study where they take a test or something. And so that yoke design is making it so that if your experimental condition stops and moves on, so does the control condition. The idea of the yoke design is that one group or one person has to do the same thing, has to be led by the other person. And so there are lots of different ways that you can employ this, but if you're not working with a time-based experiment, this is not as useful to you. And so I didn't make it a required piece of knowledge, just wanted to introduce you to the idea. And one of the more common ways to deal with validity issues is through the use of statistics. So if you have two groups of people and you gather information about their age, and you gather information about their gender, about their social economic status, and you want to see, okay, well, does this study method improve grades better than this other study method, but you don't want all of those personal things to affect your results, you can actually put those into different types of analyses to see, okay, well, do boys versus girls do better? Do people of different ages do better? Do people of different socioeconomic statuses do better? Okay, none of them really mattered. However, the different study methods did make an effect on your test grades. Okay, great. We use statistics to deal with those validity concerns. It's a very common way to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to solve all of your problems, but it's one of the easiest way to deal with it, to use math and statistics to deal with validity concerns. It's kind of a catch-all. It's very common, not the only thing you can do, and it really depends on what type of research you're doing, whether or not a statistical analysis can help you deal with those issues. All right, the last thing here for validity concerns are isolating effects. What am I talking about here? So you want to make sure like I said in the previous section and in the beginning of this section, that your experimental condition is really comparing your experimental condition, what you're looking at, compared to your control condition. And so you're never going to do that perfectly. But there are some choices you can make outside of your experiment to make sure you're finding the results that are actually accurate. You can always replicate your research, so do the study again, see if you get the same results. You can replicate and expand the research, so do the study again, but add something to it or change something about it to see if you get similar results or the same results. Those are going to provide evidence that yes, the conclusions you're getting are true and accurate. One of my favorite ways to do this is actually through the use of converging evidence. Different from replications, a replication being you just redo the study, a converging bit of evidence is where you do a similar or a related study that would provide a totally different set of evidence for the same conclusion. So let's say that you think that even though we can't really see it or touch it, there's such a thing as air in the world. And so one thing you can do is you can blow air into a balloon. And in that case, if there's more air, the balloon gets bigger, so you know there must be something called air. There must be something in that space. It's not just nothing. But what else can we do? Well, we can do another experiment. You can try to cover a candle. And so the thing is, if you cover up a candle, you put like a glass over the candle, you know that fire needs air. And so if you cover up the candle will go out. Not because you're smothering the flame. You can give it lots of space underneath that cup, but because it needs that air and it uses up the air over time. And so that's another bit of evidence, a converging bit of evidence that air exists. And the idea behind converging evidence is that you're coming at that conclusion in different ways, but those different ways reach the same conclusion. Converging evidence is wonderful because it's one of the best things we can do to prove our conclusions are accurate. Alright, that'll be it for this chapter. We're going to take a look at discussion, how to put your discussion section together, and how to write your abstract in the last section, the next video. Hope this stuff has been interesting and exciting. We'll see you in a bit.